Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. Reed Galen is a co-founder of the Lincoln Project and also the founder of the Union, a single-issue, pro-democracy coalition of grassroots volunteers and partner organizations dedicated to defeating Donald Trump and the MAGA party at the polls in November. I'm thrilled to be able to talk with him today. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Reed, welcome to Did Nothing Wrong. I'm glad you could join me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I did an episode a few weeks back where I was trying to figure out why things went so bad for the Trump campaign recently, because they really seem like they've been in full flail mode for about a month and a half now. And I'm preparing to do this episode, and I came across this press release from the Lincoln Project saying that you were going to go off and start doing your own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And coincidentally, it happens right about the time the Trump campaign starts flailing. So I got to ask, what did you do?
Yes, I worked all my voodoo magic.
What kind of curse did you put on these people? I mean,
well, listen, nothing that they hadn't already put on themselves, to be honest with you. No, I think that first, thanks again for having me. Second, left LP, after founding it, almost 5 years ago. It's hard to believe.
Wow.
And I took our grassroots organization, which we call the Union, and you can find jointheunion.us with me. And, we've got 50,000 volunteers in all 50 states. And obviously we are focused up and down the ballot from president to, county commissioner, mostly in the key electoral college states, but, in other places as well. And so it has been a rewarding move. The stuff that we did at Lincoln was and is still second to none, I think, from a political communications perspective. But, on the Trump thing, look, I have no love or admiration or really even respect for anybody that works for Donald Trump, no matter how good at their jobs they are or were. But your question is the right one. And the only thing I can think is that after the debate between Trump and President Biden, as President Biden's candidacy, let's call, seemed to be in question, I don't think they could ever imagine a situation in which Biden wouldn't be the guy they were running against. Because if you think about it, not just as a presidential campaign, but as a movement, right? MAGA is an authoritarian movement. Mm-hmm. They had spent years setting up this whole idea that Donald Trump and Joe Biden were equally bad. That, if Donald Trump had a crime family, Hunter Biden was just as corrupt as any of Trump's kids. That if Trump was corrupt, that Biden had done a whole bunch of stuff throughout his career that made him equally corrupt. And then obviously there was the thing that we saw on camera in Atlanta that night, which was, in the contest of two old men, Donald Trump appeared to be the one who was dominant and vigorous, and Biden seemed to be the one who had lost a step.
Right.
And so they believed, and you referenced an article in The Atlantic, I think by a guy named Tim Alberta, where they just seemed to think that they were so, ready to just romp. But I'll tell you the thing that, a couple of things. One is a group that I'm friendly with did a survey in Michigan the week after the debate, and it showed that Donald Trump was only up 6 points. I mean, that's a lot. It's outside the margin of error, but also if Donald Trump was like 20% more normal, like he'd have been up 15.
Right.
Right. The bottom would have fallen out of Biden's candidacy, but it didn't. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't going to be very difficult. It was hard before the debate. It was going to be harder after. But that showed that Trump did and still has an enormous downward pressure on his candidacy because obviously it starts and ends with him personally. But the things that he espouses from a political perspective are unpopular too. Last thing on the political malpractice front is I know a lot of the people that work for Trump. The idea that they did not have anything ready to go when Biden chose to step aside that Sunday and Harris took the mantle, we would have been doing for weeks. Okay, what do we think the biggest hits on Harris are? What do we think the biggest hits on Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, anybody? I mean, it was going to be, to me, it always seemed like if Biden stepped aside, it was going to be Harris. But just in the assumption that it could have been someone else, we would have had all of this stuff ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
And, media time bought, press releases, all this stuff would have been ready to go. And in fact, even before a paid campaign, we would have had all of the talking heads, the influencers, everybody else saying Kamala Harris is a communist, all the stuff they're trying to say now.
Right.
The problem is, Griff, is that to your point, they waited a month before they got their feet underneath them. Then it was really, what can we throw at the wall? Then he kept saying Trump kept saying and doing more and more stupid and insane things, gave them basically, the Democrats, a free week of airtime in Chicago. And now here we are after Labor Day, and they're still trying to figure out what to do. And so it was, I think, a combination of lack of imagination, which is ironic because it's how we got Trump in the first place. And I think a decision on the part of the people around him that, we can't control him anymore. We're not going to try and control him anymore. And we just can hope to God that, he pulls that lucky horseshoe out of his rear end one more time.
Right. And I remember thinking at the time that it was insane that they didn't have something immediately ready to go on Harris, because it strikes me, and again, I'm a guy with a podcast. You're a guy who's helped run presidential campaigns. I find myself thinking, how do you not have at least something ready to go in the chamber? Why did they not do that? And the article that came out of The Atlantic just struck me as the kind of thing that I cannot believe you would ever say that in public, because they made it sound like, yeah, we got a landslide coming. It's going to be a landslide. Y'all better get on board with this. And it's like, man, maybe I'm just from some different place where I don't believe in talking like that about things like this, but wow.
Yeah, I mean, look, arrogance has always been a hallmark of Trump and his operations, but I think it also goes to the, I'd call it almost hypnotic effect that being around him has on the people close to him.
Yeah.
That he infects them with this, I'll call it unreality. It's not confidence. Confidence says you feel good about what you're doing and you feel like you have an opportunity to do something, win a football game or whatever it is, right?
Right.
This is, detachment from reality. And that's the same reason why, Trump thought he was going to win so big that he allowed himself to be convinced, not by his campaign team, but by Tucker Carlson and Don Jr., that J.D. Vance was the right choice for his VP, right?
He was, if you want him to lose.
Right. We're going to win like a landslide anyway. So what difference does it make? We might as well have somebody who fires up the base, who, can carry the mantle and all this other stuff. And instead, he's a disaster. He's 2 years into his, not even 2 years into his United States Senate tenure. And he's not very good at this.
No.
And so now you have a situation where he does, and this is the other part about Vance is, vice presidential nominees are supposed to be the attack dogs in these kinds of things. They don't often make an electoral difference, except that Vance, every time he opens his mouth or every time a new piece of video shows up, he said something more strange, weird, misogynistic. I told my kid, shut the hell up. It's Trump on the phone, right? Like,
yeah,
what? Who says that stuff? Like, who admits it?
And he doubles down on this kind of thing. Like, somebody calls him on the whole point about, well, you said that the Democratic Party is being run by cat ladies. And he has to go and double down on this and say, yeah, I did. It was funny. It's like, okay.
Well, but I think but you're raising a really important point here, which is MAGA never goes back to the light. They never moderate back towards normal. If they're caught in something like that, Griff, they always double and triple down. They always do that because to them, anything else is a sign of weakness.
Right.
And so they're like, okay, well, here we are. I mean, just think about back in late, December of 2023, when Nikki Haley terribly flubbed an easy softball question about the causes of the Civil War. Right.
Right.
And she spent the next week cleaning it up. If Donald Trump had been asked that question and answered it that way with all the attendant fury, he would have poured gasoline on it, right? Going,
yes.
No, the Confederacy maybe wasn't that bad, or there were very good people on both sides, like whatever it was. Robert E. Lee was a hero. We should still have statues of him, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what he would have done, and that's what he's doing, and that's what Vance is doing, which is, no, I'm not sorry I said the cat lady thing. It's true. It's, unmarried women or married women without children make me uncomfortable. Like that's a much more deep-seated, like psychological and emotional issue that's on display from both of these people.
Uh-huh. And I think a lot of women have heard that. They've heard what he's saying. They've heard what he means behind that. And they're pretty fired up to come out and tell him what they think of these statements and a guy who's saying them in November. And speaking of November, you've got a new project that you're doing. It's called The Union. Mm-hmm. And you describe this as a single issue pro-democracy coalition of grassroots volunteers and partner organizations. Can you talk about how this came together?
Yeah, so we actually started the Union inside the Lincoln Project 2.5 years ago. And it was an idea born, like so many great things are, in a coffee shop in rainy Austin, Texas at the end of 2021, me and a guy who had been a super volunteer in the tech world for Barack Obama in 2008. And we said, Lincoln has such an incredible reach and it's got all these people and all these followers and all this enthusiasm. How can we how can we take some of that energy and apply it to the grassroots? And so we came up with the Union, which was really just started with a website and a couple of volunteers. And, over the course of the last 2.5 years, it has grown into a nationwide grassroots hub. Again, it has 50,000 of its own volunteers, 12,000 of those are doing something almost on the daily. We have state teams, people who, again, they give their heart and soul to this. They're recruiting new volunteers every day. And so we have the things that the Union itself will work on if it's a particular political issue in Pennsylvania related to the presidential or a congressional race or a state legislative race. But we also have more than 100 partner organizations, and we say, okay, how can we help you? And so, whether or not it's Field Team 6, they do voter registration, or Souls to the Polls, they provide rides to people, right? How do we make sure that they have the bodies they need to conduct their operations? So Field Team 6 needs people texting people, calling people, sending out voter registration cards. Souls to the Polls needs drivers. They need people with cars, all that, right? To make sure that all of those people who have great organizations and do great work, but are probably under-resourced, both staff, financially, and just people-wise, have the tools and the people they need to get that stuff done. And we came up with an idea and we turned it loose, and to see what it's become is just incredible. And so, we now, on any given day, we have nearly 2,000 volunteer opportunities that we're pushing out. We update them daily. And so if there's anything you want to do, any place you live, right, you can get involved. There's nothing, distance is not a problem. Not having a car is not a problem. Not being able to go door to door is not a problem. If you want to get involved, the Union, which is, again, jointheunion.us, is a way you can do that. The other part of it is doing some targeted digital advertising to soft Republicans in these key electoral college states, specifically Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, to do one of two things, right? One is, if you can believe that the country is more important than party, vote for Kamala Harris. But if you can't do that, skip it. Just don't vote for Donald Trump. You owe him nothing. Right? You owe him nothing. He's not a conservative. He's not a Republican. These are a lot of people who probably voted for Nikki Haley in the primaries. They are particularly upset with him on national security issues, NATO, Ukraine, and Israel. And there's a lot of them like me who have 2 daughters at home who are very uncomfortable with the government overreach aspects of the Dobbs decision. And so it's not, abortion might be the motivating issue, but the value proposition for them is individual liberty. I don't like anybody telling me, or certainly my family, what we have to do or the kinds of decisions we have to make in my house. And that's a very sort of Republican value that really Trump and MAGA have just really cast aside. They are big government, centralized control people.
Right. Weird how that ended up working out, that here we are dealing with the party of extremely big government right in your bedroom, right in your house, right everywhere, ended up being them. It's not how I remember it being sold, but okay, there we are.
Right.
And I got to say that I really like your approach here because, personally, I've been in favor of a big tent or popular front, whatever you want to call it, strategy since the day after the 2016 election. And, obviously there's some huge differences to iron out, but I feel like most of them probably will have to be ironed out after Trump is not a factor in our national political situation. Because he's a unique threat to the situation. And as long as he's a part of this conversation, we're kind of stuck in this place where nothing much is going to end up getting done. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, but I mean, here's the good news, bad news is Donald Trump loses and loses badly in November. Very good. We've bought ourselves 4 years, but we should not underestimate the fact that, one, remember, this guy got nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Right. And he's still going to be under enormous legal and financial pressure. Right. So his ability to just sort of disappear, A, he's not capable of it, and B, he's not going to do it. And we should also not underestimate the fact that the right-wing wackos, uber conservatives who have built this movement over the course of 50 years, and their biggest donors and benefactors have poured billions of dollars into it. Like, they're not just going to give up because Donald Trump lost. Right. They're going to say, okay, where do we go now? Look, having a black woman as president will give them a lot of fodder for their most virulent base voters and supporters, right? Like, we should not underestimate that. We saw it with Barack Obama. We should not be surprised if we see it with Kamala Harris. In the what I call the neo-Confederacy, right, of the Old South, right, and the Mountain West where I live, like, MAGA has seeped in, right? Like, these people believe this stuff now. And then you add in, Griff, just to make it a little bit more complicated and disconcerting, the piece of the evangelical religious movement, where all of those people have a demand that, like, Donald Trump, when last week when he flip-flopped on Amendment 4 in Florida, that was going to overturn the 6-week ban.
Right.
The evangelical leaders went crazy on him on social media.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They're like, we need to find somebody more pure. You should stay home. He's betrayed the movement, all this other stuff. And he quickly flopped back to where he was. But again, these people are true believers. And, do I think that the outer rings of the GOP will peel away? Yes, but he is still the center of gravity for the party, as is the movement that he sort of helped birth, almost a decade ago. And it's hard to believe that.
It's been about 10 years almost since he really started taking the reins of this thing. And at first I thought maybe it was a 50-50 split between his people and what we would think of as, Republicans before all of that happened. But now I think we're looking at a lot less of the people, like, say, for instance, you, who at one point was definitely a Republican, but got disgusted by what was going on with this guy and walked away from it. I think that a lot of those people have already gone. And what he's left with are the people who are that hardcore nationalist authoritarian base that think everything he's doing is great.
Right.
And this is why I think a lot of people don't necessarily get it about the work you're doing and the work you've done in the past. But I like that you brought up the micro-targeting, because a lot of the work that you've done focuses around micro-targeting and talking to a very specific group of people that might not be reachable otherwise. And because those margins are so small now, every one of those votes is very important.
Right.
And Trump knew this in 2016. I think that was how he was able to win the Electoral College. I mean, he lost the popular vote by a ton, but he was able to find 100,000 votes between Pennsylvania and Michigan and managed to win based basically on that. And I saw several efforts like that, both from the Lincoln Project and several others in the 2020 cycle. And it all seems to have paid off. They were able to peel off that maybe 2 to 3% that was movable. How many people do you think are still on the fence, I guess?
I don't think many, but I think that it's important to understand too that, the research and the targeting of individual voters is as sophisticated as it's ever been. And the ability to reach them is at a little bit of a crossroads. There's still so much of a bias towards broadcast and cable television, because the press likes to write about it and the consultants make big fat commissions off of it. So, the incentives are all wrong, but digital advertising is a far more effective and efficacious way to reach somebody. I mean, if I have your cell phone number, I can reach you directly ad nauseum. Like, you can't get rid of me no matter how hard you try, and that data is all readily available at this point. But here's the thing. That's one tool in the toolbox. You have to say, okay, what's the value? I understand that this is the issues that these people care about or what they're telling me they care about. Okay, but what's the value proposition that those issues represent? And I think this is if there is a dividing line between how Republicans campaign and Democrats campaign on issues, which is the head, and Republicans campaign on values, which is the heart.
Right.
And the heart's going to make the decision, and then the head's going to wrap rationality around it so it makes sense to us and we can explain it to ourselves and others. And so, when I'm talking about these national security voters who don't like Trump, right? Okay, well, yes, it's NATO. Yes, it's Ukraine. Yes, it's Israel. But the value proposition is really America's place in the world, how I as an American feel about our place in the world and how I see my country. I love my country. Right. America is the greatest country that humanity's ever known. I happen to believe most of that is true. We have our issues, but that's how these voters see the world. Right. And so you speak to them in an iconography that is not, we have to have, NATO because Article 5 and blah, blah, blah. No, you say like, here's a fighter jet. Here's an American flag. Here's an eagle. Right. You speak in the iconography of, Ronald Reagan. Right. You, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, right? All those things speak to a time when those voters, most of them are older white guys in the suburbs. They're educated, upper income. Look, if you have time to worry about NATO, it's probably because you've made enough money to have time to worry about NATO, right? But they remember the Cold War.
Right.
The Soviets then and the Russians now have never been our friends. And so they're like, why is he so cozy with them now? Right. And then you bring J.D. Vance into the fold, who is, just like all Russia all the time. And again, that doesn't make any sense to them because what you're basically saying is, no, we're okay with the United States being the sick man of the world, right? That we're not the predominant power in the world. And that's something that, frankly, we could do a whole other show on this. Most Americans don't understand that, like, our hegemony allows for our lifestyle. Right. Whether you like that or not, whether that's disconcerting or uncomfortable or not, like we get to do things that no one else gets to do because we're America and no one else is. And then, as I mentioned with the Dobbs decision, we call them Dobbs dads. The issue is abortion and these massive strictures, no exceptions for incest, life of the mother, rape. But the value proposition is like, I don't want the government and unelected bureaucrats or even elected officials, right, in some city I don't live in, telling me what I can and can't do, what my family has to do, right? It's an overarching government thing. I mean, Mike Johnson, before he got elected speaker, gave a speech where he said, yeah, we want government in your bedroom. Like that is antithetical to the old GOP, which was, in Tim Walz's words from the convention, mind your own damn business.
Yeah. And at one point, that really was the ethic. That was the idea of smaller government, get government off your back. And you end up with this thing that's become guys like J.D. Vance who would be fine with a theocracy as long as it was their theocracy. And I think that probably scares the hell out of a lot of people looking at what this guy wants and kind of being like, I don't know, man.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's right. It's, this goes back to, America is a Christian nation.
Right.
Well, this is, again, one of the myths that's been built up. I mean, the men, and they were all men, who, founded the country were deists, right? Like maybe they read the Bible, but, they certainly they weren't Catholics by any stretch, right? And they weren't Protestants. I mean, if they were, I guess they were Protestants, but they didn't go to church and sing hymns, right? They didn't identify with Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, right?
No. There's a distinct lack of that kind of writing or speeches from any of the founding fathers for some reason.
Right. I mean, look, did they perhaps use a passage from the Bible here or there? They were more likely to use a passage from a Greek or a Roman, right? They were classicists. They were the end of the Enlightenment. And they specifically wrote, a separation of church and state into the Constitution, which is, you want to worship how you worship. That's great. You are free to do that. That does not mean that you have the freedom to tell others, right?
Right.
It's freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And look, most Americans still consider themselves somewhat religious or people of faith. And so I don't think that we should at all deny those people who hold those values or go to church or attend synagogue or go to their mosque or whatever, their temple, whatever the case might be. But most of the people doing that are like, yeah, this is who we are. This is how we practice our faith. And, like, I'm not asking anybody else to do it. And I'm not asking anybody else to live the way I demand that they live, which is ironic considering that, like, so many of the people that we see in the evangelical movement keep getting picked up for, like, having, terrible things on their computer or having done terrible things to children.
And these are the first people that are prepared to pass bills and laws talking about other people who are supposedly doing these same things. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
So you originally came to this fight as a Republican strategist, but you came out against Trump pretty hard in 2016, and you've been catching hell from your former party, among others, for it ever since. Walk me through what 2016 was like for you and what made you realize that you couldn't support any of this and you had to start saying something. Because a lot of people realized it was bad, but not a lot of people on that side of the fence actually said anything.
Well, look, I mean, when he came down the escalator and gave that speech, I said, well, this is insane, and there's no possible way he'll get the nomination.
Right.
This is a scam. This is all a scam just for him to, make some more money and, get a TV deal or whatever the case was. And then, I remember being with a bunch of national political reporters, watching live as he said, as he insulted John McCain, who I had worked for,
right,
saying, I like my heroes who didn't get captured. Then I was at another event with a bunch of national political reporters sitting in a bar when, he talked about Megyn Kelly and the blood coming out of everywhere. Like, okay, well, that's done. Right. But I was like, this is not a serious person. Right. This is not anybody. I knew a lot of the people who were running, and I knew a lot of the people working for those candidates. I didn't want to, I had just, intentionally taken a step aside from presidential politics. And then when you saw that, like, no, he wasn't going down in the polls, he was going up in the polls. And then, in December, remember, he came out with the first version of his Muslim ban.
Right.
Right. And so I'll just tell you, like, there was never a moment from the escalator forward where I was ever like, I could make peace with this.
Yeah.
Right. There was never a moment when I was like, oh, yeah, this will be okay. And then as it was clear, because we were doing some research for a client, that it was going to be, and this is December of 15, that it was going to be Trump versus Hillary. I'm like, well, this is not good. Like, and we should try and do everything we can. And then the primary started and it worked out the way we thought it would. And I remember having dinner with one of my best friends who I don't really talk to anymore, candidly. And I said, how can you be for this guy? He's the leader of the party. So what? Well, if that's what the party wants, that's what the party wants. And I'm part of the party. And I'm like, not me. If that's what the party wants, like, count me out. Right. I mean, I worked for George W. Bush going back to 1997 when he was a first-term governor in Texas, and I was at school in Austin. Right. His biggest issues were education and immigration.
Yeah.
Right. When before 9/11, his first big policy win was education with Teddy Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, like, I mean, that's a world that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And then, I'm also a student of history, right? So, like, I hadn't lived through any of this, but, like, I was able to recognize, like, I know what this is. I see what this is, right? And, you go back to Mussolini or Hitler or, any, Pinochet, any of the authoritarians, like, exactly, if you've done any sort of research or spent as much time with frickin' history books as I do, like, I knew exactly what this was when I saw it. I'm like, we cannot have this.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you this, I was so deep in my own confirmation bias that I didn't think there was any possibility he could win. And then when he did, of course, it was like a gut punch. And then, spent the next 3 years going, well, what the hell are we going to do now?
Right. And it's fascinating now that they're completely masked off about this stuff. They've got people like Jack Posobiec writing books where they spend hundreds of pages praising Francisco Franco and how he did such a great job. And it's like, okay, so you're just being completely out in front about what you guys are and what you guys want now. This is just amazing. And you're right about how that world just doesn't exist anymore. I remember vividly that 2000 presidential election, and it seemed like Al Gore was trying so hard to run away from Clinton that basically the biggest argument I seem to remember them having was over Social Security.
Sure.
And it's kind of like these two guys are very different. They're going to want very different things, but they are running campaigns that are not too far off of each other. I can kind of see why a lot of this came down to a few votes in Florida, because really there wasn't a whole lot of difference in what these two guys were saying at the time.
Well, look, even in the 2004 reelect, right, where I was still working for President Bush against John Kerry. Yes, it was a national security election, but the kinds of the policy arguments they were having was like, should the top marginal tax rate be 38.2% or 37.1%?
Yeah.
and this was like scores of commercials and all this, stuff about, like, here's who's really going to save you more money on taxes and yada, yada, yada. And that's not where we are anymore. Right. And again, I feel like, this last 9, almost 10 years has been instructive and evolutionary for me, not revolutionary, but evolutionary for me. Because I'll tell you, Griff, it really made me sort of re-examine everything that I'd grown up with. Because remember, I grew up in the GOP.
Right.
Like other kids went to summer camp. I went to Capitol Hill with my dad. Right. So like I've been doing this since I was like 7.
Yeah.
Which probably turns out is probably the reason I am the way I am. But like I took everything at face value. And I spent no time when I was a Republican operative really thinking about the philosophy or what's right, what's wrong, where should we be? Either of these parties, do they represent me? Do they represent anybody? I think they represent, more people are unhappy with what the choices they have now than they've ever been.
Right.
So this has been really the opportunity for me to embark on something much bigger than just electoral politics.
Definitely. And, I'm sure you've probably spent a lot of time doing kind of some soul searching. I mean, the more you hang around people who don't necessarily agree with everything that you're saying, that you have a goal, you have a purpose, but you're not necessarily on the same page on all the issues. You can't help but kind of hear some of what they have to say and say, maybe there's something to that. This is an issue that I previously thought, maybe I thought this about, but now that I'm actually around people who live it and have some lived experience in this field, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I didn't quite get that quite the same way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, back when I was younger, you could be a Republican or you could be a conservative or you could be a conservative Republican. And I was just always a Republican.
Right.
Right. Like I would never have called myself a conservative because I've always been pro-choice. I'm, strong on national security, thinks that, like for the most part, government should run efficiently. We should not have the kind of deficits we have. But the truth is, with the exception of the national security piece, that was all malarkey on the Republicans' part too.
Yeah.
Right. Ever since basically 2001, which is like, no, tax cuts have become dogma. And, we're happy to run up the deficit because the truth is people aren't paying attention to it. So long as their taxes are low, like the printing presses keep spinning, they're not going to pay attention. And for the most part, unfortunately, they've been borne out to be right.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your national security piece, it seems like even as recently as 2015, guys like Kevin McCarthy were talking about how we had to support Ukraine. We had to support them in their fight against Russia. This is where we had to lay out for this one. And something changed. Something changed there in 2015 when Trump came along. And now all these same guys are, nope. Guys like Vance are, we don't have any business with this. We should be America first. And they don't realize that in some cases, it is definitely in our best interests to be involved in this situation. We have a lot of other allies in Europe that are going to be directly threatened if the Ukraine situation goes the wrong way.
I mean, there's just so many downstream effects to use a very clinical term, right? So, if Ukrainian grain can't get out to the world, then not only are people going hungry, but the cost of food goes up not only for us, but for everybody.
Right.
Right. If the United States doesn't have 8 carrier battle groups at sea all the time, then the supply chains that every American, me included, take for granted aren't what they need to be. And we saw the disruption in that with COVID, right?
Yeah.
We've seen the disruption of that where, a couple of ports have been hacked, right, by bad actors. And what that does to, weeks of people trying to get, stuff offloaded and what that means. And so, yeah, the United States being who and what it is, our place in the world and our place at home, frankly, I think need to match up more. I don't think they have historically.
Right.
But I think that we can and should take the opportunity now to do that. Of course, we got to get through the next 60 some days, but I do think we all as Americans, have a responsibility as citizens of the greatest power the world has ever known to say, okay, who at home isn't able to take advantage of the opportunity that most of us have? And how do we present ourselves to the world and how do we act in the world?
Right. Right. Because we may have our issues. We may have our things that we need to work on. We need to do better. Historically, we haven't treated certain groups of people real well in this country.
Right.
Historically, we have thrown our weight around sometimes where we shouldn't have. But if you look at what the alternatives are, if you look at what happens if we stop being hegemonic and withdraw, who takes over and how does that go for the rest of the world?
Right.
I believe that it's better with us in that role than it would be with Russia or China.
And look, this is, I think, an important point, too, that I think sometimes my Democratic friends miss is like most Americans love the country, right? Regardless of color, regardless of demographic, regardless of region.
Oh, yeah.
Most Americans would rather be American than anything else because being born an American is like winning life's lottery ticket.
Totally is.
Now, for some people, it's a $5 scratcher, and other people, it's the Powerball, right? But it's still typically better to be here than anywhere else. Now, to your point, I think that we do have some glaring issues here at home that we need to solve for. And, I hope that we can get through this piece, and then we have to fight a couple of fights, right? One is we have to continue to take the sword and shield to MAGA where we find it. And then we have to say, okay, we're now out of the baby boomer phase of American presidential politics for the first time in 30 frickin' years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's move into the 21st century where we all belong.
Finally, potentially going to get a Gen X president. I mean, this is
I know.
Amazing. Cross your fingers.
Right.
So why do we have such a bad memory as a collective at how bad Trump actually was at the job when he was president? I mean, are we all just that traumatized as a society at this point that we can't even process all the crazy shit that happened during his term?
I think for the first 3 years, the economy was doing well. And so I think that his insanity was upsetting to people like me and to you. And I don't want to say this to anybody in particular, but if you were, white, middle class and above, the first 3 years of the Trump presidency probably didn't affect you all that much. Now, if you're an immigrant family coming over the border, you lost your kid. You may not have found him even yet. So I'm not saying it was good for everybody. It certainly wasn't. But to your point about the trauma, I don't think as a country, as a world, as a society, we have come to grips with what happened during COVID.
No.
Right. I just think that we have a massive case of PTSD. I mean, we lost 1 million people, right? 1 million people. And we're losing more now, right? I mean, COVID's back on the rise again. And I just don't think that there's a lot of people, whether or not it was, that day in the middle of March, right, when everything locked down. Mm-hmm. And if you happen to, and I don't know if you recall this, but, if you happen to leave your house and you're driving on a highway and there's nobody else there.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It was like something out of a movie. And, my kids weren't in school. Some people's kids didn't go back to school for like 18 months, which I can't imagine. So everything was disrupted. Everything we knew about everything changed, right? And I think we're still coming to grips with that. And again, Trump is his own worst enemy. If Trump had been somebody who said we're going to get through this together, he'd be president.
Yeah.
Right? But he couldn't help himself.
It's not who he is. He doesn't rise to meet the moment.
Right. No. And he had no desire to. I mean, look, if you remember in the audio recording of Bob Woodward's book, or the audio recordings that he released of his interviews with Trump, Trump admits in January of 20 that this thing could kill millions, talking about COVID. Like he knew intellectually, he had taken it on board about how dangerous it could be. But once he realized that it was a political threat to him, that's when he said, you know what, damn the dead bodies. Mm-hmm. This is, again, all about me. And that all goes back to that self-preservation mode that he has that, I think the Brookings Institute just came out with a study. You could account for 750,000 dead Americans as a direct result of Donald Trump's incompetence and malfeasance.
Yeah. And we aren't coming to terms with that anytime soon, but you look around, you can still see it. You can see the people that used to live around here that don't. You can see the businesses that have closed down. You can see just the collective fear that we still have that this thing is around the corner. None of us had ever really had to process anything like this before. And the one time you need the leader to step up and meet the moment, the guy doesn't do it. The guy, knowing full well what this could be, decides to just be Donald Trump.
Think about all the after effects of that, right? Now you have half the country who doesn't believe in science.
Yeah.
Who doesn't believe they're doctors, right? I mean, even you remember these heartbreaking stories of people coming down with COVID, going to the hospital, not believing they had COVID, right? Saying, but I took my ivermectin or whatever, and the doctor's being like, we're going to have to put you on a ventilator. That can't be. I can't get COVID. It's not a real thing. And then 10 minutes later, they're dead.
Yeah.
Right. And again, people have accused me of having Trump derangement syndrome. Like, guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Right. Like, the guy is a terrible human being. I mean, they sat in the Roosevelt room, with coffee service and croissants and everything else, and made a proactive choice to let people in blue states die because they were political opponents.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, Jared Kushner is, he was the handmaiden to 1 million dead Americans.
Mm-hmm. And how much money did they and their friends and their connected people make off of various purchases and supplies of PPE that never showed up anywhere? I mean, they ran that program as an absolute grift.
For sure. Because that's all it is. I used to say this more often than I do, but maybe I should start saying it again this close to the election. Like, the Republican Party is not a political party, right? It is part of an authoritarian movement. But the authoritarian movement, its goals are not much different from a gang. Territory, money, self-aggrandizement. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have, there's no broader goal. It's power, money, influence, the ability to tell other people what to do, to say, that's mine now. You can't have that. You can't do that. Don't read that book. Don't have this procedure.
Right.
I think sometimes we overcomplicate this stuff. It's just about power and the money and the others, the influence that is attendant to it. That's all they're about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, remember the evangelical movement, the Southern Baptist Convention in 1973, when the Roe v. Wade decision came down, was 100% behind it. Thought it was a great decision.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It was only in the 1970s, after Jimmy Carter had won as an evangelical Democrat, that the evangelical conservatives said, well, we got to find an issue to take on. And they decided it was going to be abortion. Right? It's been a grift from the get-go.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And you can tell by the fact that so many of these people, once the Dobbs decision came down, have tried to run away from it in one form or another. You could tell that they didn't really want to catch that car.
No, and they can't help it.
They were hoping that this would be something they could fundraise off in perpetuity, but unfortunately.
Right. And look, the hypocrisy. I mean, Senator Rick Scott in Florida is running an ad now talking about how supportive he is of IVF. Like 2 days after he voted against it in the Senate.
Seriously.
Right? Like, they are morons politically, but they're smart enough to read survey results, and they see this is a terrible issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what I would say to my Democratic friends is, like, don't let them off the frickin' hook.
Yeah. Every chance you get, ask them about this. Make sure that they have to answer that question. Make them squirm.
Right.
Because they are squirming, especially as a result of this. The more of their agenda comes out, the less people like it.
Yeah. And that's another thing Walt said, I thought, in a very prompt, short but punchy speech. This is not an agenda anybody asked for. No, it isn't. Nobody wants this besides whatever heritage has turned into these days and the people like JD Vance. Yeah.
This is something that is just going to get dropped on people's heads in the form of Project 2025 if they get elected.
Right.
And I think people really, once they woke up to what was in that document, what they really wanted to do, things got very much more serious for a lot of people. They're like, ooh, these are not laws I want to live under.
Right. Again, so think about this, and this is something we should expand on, and I'll do it the way I can too, is when's the last time you had a presidential campaign that had to explicitly run away from the platform that it laid out? Right? They're running for their lives, right? Because they know this stuff is unpopular, right? The Republican convention in Milwaukee was predicated on the idea that they were going to run against Joe Biden, like we talked about at the top.
Uh-huh.
And everything after that went to hell in a handbasket for them because they didn't know what to do. And like, oh God, people really hate this stuff. What are we going to do? Oh, let's get rid of NOAA, the weather people, right? That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
The people that, like, boaters, farmers, people in Florida and the Gulf Coast or Tornado Alley rely on to make sure, like, they don't get crushed, right?
Yeah.
Under the weight of some storm. Let's get rid of FEMA, the people who are supposed to clean up after that stuff. Or let's go to the other end of the spectrum of insanity. Let's restart nuclear testing for the first time in 30 years. Like, oh yeah, that'll make the Chinese and the Russians feel better.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Like, what are you talking about? Right? This stuff is crazy. And, like, that's just the tip of the iceberg to your point. This is 900 pages of crazy.
Uh-huh.
And, whatever Trump wants to say about how he didn't know anything about it, like, it's BS.
Uh-huh.
They know everything about it.
Yeah, and we've covered that in detail here. The idea that he can say whatever he wants about how he doesn't know. And then we'll play the clips of the guys from Heritage saying, well, yeah, we know he has to say that.
Right.
It's like, you can't not say this stuff in front of a mic. You just can't.
And his people, the Trump's people, the MAGA goons, they're all over that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all the people who, if he were to win, would take office.
Mm-hmm.
Again, these are not good people.
No.
I'm sorry, Griff. I'm out of grace for a lot of these people, right? I know I'm supposed to turn the other cheek and all that, but like, to your point, they say this stuff out loud. They say it out. I mean, I worked at my first Republican convention in 1992 for George H.W. Bush. Right. And then I worked for his son, George W. Bush, in 2000 in Philadelphia. And the idea that in Milwaukee, they had printed signs, professionally printed signs that say mass deportation now, with all these old blue-haired ladies like smiling and waving them. Like it was like Nuremberg 1935. Right? Like, what the hell are you talking about?
And it's amazing how far they've come on that issue, because there's a clip out there, I'm sure you've seen it, of the 1980 Republican presidential debate where you've got Ronald Reagan and George Bush talking about immigration. And it's like Bush talking about how we should be as compassionate as anyone's ever been to these people.
Right.
And Reagan talking about, if we don't bolster Mexico's economy, eventually this is never going to stop. And the Cubans are going to be able to cause all kinds of problems in here. And you're listening to this and going, what the hell happened? How did we get from that?
Well, remember that it was Reagan who declared an amnesty in 1986.
Yeah.
And then in his valedictory speech the night before he left office, went back to it again. Right? About how we are the great melting pot and like the part. And, like, Griff, this is the thing that, like, I wish more of us understood. Like, if you go to France, it's full of the French.
Yes.
You go to Italy, it's full of Italians. You go to China, it's full of the Chinese. Right? You come to America, we're Americans.
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody like that in the world, right? There's nobody else like that in the world. And that's our strength. My great-grandparents came here in 1905 because they were sick of getting beat up by the Cossacks in, Poland or Lithuania, wherever the hell they were from. There was no name for it. It was always changing names, right? But like, I literally wouldn't be alive if they hadn't made that choice.
Right.
Right? I would literally not exist at this moment. Right? And there was just a story in the Atlantic, I think it was this month or last month, about these people crossing the Darien Gap from northern Colombia into Panama. And it's a horrific tale.
Oh, yeah.
Of children dying and everything else. And to me, I know maybe I'm off base here, but if you've been willing to do that, to take those risks, to put yourself and your family through that trial and that gauntlet, it seems to me that that's the kind of people we want, because they're going to do everything they can to be as good a citizen as they can, to make the best of what they can, to work hard, to contribute, to make sure their kids contribute. Like, we are so lucky. I mean, Griff, we have no ability to understand, as I talked about a few minutes ago, like how lucky we were to be born here, right? We take it for granted.
And the grandparents and great-grandparents of a lot of the people who are screaming the hardest about immigration now are the same people who in their day were doing the equivalent of the Darien Gap, coming across in steerage in the third deck of some freighter from the old country, having to deal with all kinds of prejudice and discrimination when they got here. Those were those people at one point, and now we're 3 generations on from that, and their descendants want to pull up the ladder. It's just insane.
Yeah, look, I mean, there was, no Irish, no Jews, no Russians, no Germans, no Greeks, right? Whatever it was, right? No Italians. We don't want any of you.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they have been the strength of the country. And I would say, look, I mean, there are lines on a map for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that we should have an understanding of who's coming and have some system in place. But, the idea that you're just going to shut down the border, right, or that you're going to deport 11 million people. And let me ask you, Griff, just let's make this real. How do you fill an 11 million person hole in the economy? Like, how does that happen? Like, what does that look like?
You can't. It's impossible.
No, you can't. And you wouldn't. You know why? Because only a moron would do that.
Mm-hmm.
Or a crazed ideologue like we're dealing with.
And yet they hand out the signs at the convention and have everybody waving them. It's insane. It's like, have you thought this through?
They have. That's the problem. That's the scary part. They have. And this is the choice they made. I mean, it's a brilliant point you just made. They have thought it through.
Mm-hmm. You got guys like Stephen Miller going on the Bannon show and saying it's going to be a project on the scale of the Panama Canal with the ferocity of how Israel is pursuing the Gaza war. And it's like, are you listening to yourself? Do you have any fucking idea?
No, but think about that. I mean, so near where I live, right, there's an apartment complex, right? Multifamily housing. Right. The vast majority of it is, Hispanic, Latino,
right?
A lot of immigrants. I mean, you tell me what's going to happen if you go to the third floor, of one of those buildings and try and pull someone's grandmother out. Yeah. Like, how do you think that's going to go? Do you think that's going to go well, or do you think that's going to go badly?
Yeah.
Right. And that's the other part too, is like, I wish our friends in the media would ask these questions. Like, tell us exactly how this works.
Yeah.
Tell us who's going to do it. Who are you going to deputize? Where are you going to put these people? Who's responsible for safety and sanitation? Let's say you fly 400 people to Guatemala and Guatemala's like, I don't want them.
Yeah.
Right. We're not taking them back. Right. And here's the other part. Like, the worst part is, the Central and South America is an incredibly diverse place, right? Like, they all have their own customs, their own language, their own vernacular, right? But like, to these people, they're all brown and they're all south of the Rio Grande. So really just dump them wherever. Like, how's that going to go?
Yeah. Ship them back south. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. How's that going to go? It doesn't go.
Yeah. It's insane. And we've gotten to a point here where this is a serious policy issue for them. They seem to think it's worth spending billions to even try it. I don't even think it's possible. I think no matter what you threw at it.
But if I might go back to what I said earlier, for them, the value proposition is white is good and anything else is bad.
Right.
We're in charge and we want those people to go away.
Yeah. And that's where we are at this point.
Yeah.
So what, in your opinion, needs to happen between now and November 5th for us to have the best chance of not letting any of this happen, of beating Trump in the polls?
So I think from the Harris campaign, at the strategic level, they need to fight a two-front war. They need to spend a lot of time, money, and resources, frankly, introducing the vice president and Governor Walz to the country, because in our research, Griff, she's still very much a blank slate.
Right.
Right. She's got good positives. Right. And our research demonstrated that her speech was very well thought of in Chicago. But again, she's still largely unknown. And this is not unusual for vice presidents. Yeah. Right. I mean, it was John Adams, our first vice president, who said this is the worst job humanity's ever created. Right. Most voters, if they've thought about her at all, probably don't really remember that she was a senator from California or that she was attorney general before that.
Right.
Right. It's just, if you live in Wisconsin, like the senator from California, like you get one of those once in a while. You get a John McCain, right? A senator who rose above it all. Right. You find somebody like that but he also ran for national office. So I think they have a real opportunity and responsibility to define her in a way that is true, because I think most of the things that they would say about her happen to be true, but are also positive and broad-based, that, a lot of Americans, former Republicans, conservative-leaning independents, that narrow gap that is still undecided, say, okay, I'm good with this. Meanwhile, they need to, metaphorically beat Trump about the head and neck 24/7, 365 or whatever it is, right? I'm messing it up. But the point is, for the next 66 days, do not let Trump off the mat.
Yeah.
They need to remind everybody who might be worried about him that he is the wrong choice. And if that even means Republicans, just as I said at the beginning, skip it, right? I just can't deal with this anymore. I don't want it anymore. Yes, I'm a Republican. Maybe I'm not convinced, maybe I am worried about Kamala Harris, but I just can't deal with another 4 years of him. And then at the grassroots level, it's making sure that every available body that isn't registered gets registered, and that every available registered voter turns out from my perspective, what's the pro-democracy candidate. Now, I'll say this. Those are all Democrats at this point, because the Republican Party, the one I grew up in, is not a pro-democracy party anymore.
No.
Right. And that's sad. And we could do another 3 hours on that. But from my perspective, this is, again, the biggest fight that we've had in generations. We need to take it seriously. And I'll tell you this, I'd much rather be where we are today than the Trump campaign, which will only get nastier, uglier, and more insane in the next 2 months.
Yeah. And in the immediate period after the election, I think, is when they may be at their worst, because if you look at the stuff they're doing with Trump Force 47 to do what they're calling poll monitoring. They used to call it Stop the Steal, but they sort of shot the branding on that one on January 6th, so can't call it that anymore. Looks like what they're going to try and do is pursue a very legal strategy to sow doubt in the results in order to try and get the certification decisions in front of what they hope are friendly legislatures.
Yeah, and look, that's and yes, you're 100% right. In fact, one of my colleagues and I started talking about how we're going to get involved in that because we were saying, okay, there's all this work, there's all these people doing all this stuff. Okay, what happens as soon as the last poll closes? Right. Then what? And you're 100% correct because we should be on the lookout for the kinds of things they're going to do to call, as you said, the results into question. Is that a demonstration at a polling place? Is that messing with a vehicle trying to get, votes from a precinct to a tabulation center, whatever? Like, we should assume that all of this is in the works somewhere and hope to God that it's not. But we should be prepared because they told us what they were willing to do last time. And we should assume they're willing to do it this time as well. But that also goes to why everything before the polls close is so important, is that we want a blowout. Yeah. The bigger a blowout this is, the less likely it is that some of these people are going to go, yeah, sure, I'm willing to go to federal prison for this, right? Because I don't think they are.
Yeah.
But you are 100% right, is that we should take nothing for granted. There will be legal challenges. There will be all these other things. And this is why, like, when back in 2022, when we were at the Lincoln Project and the union on the ground, the only things we focused on were the gubernatorial and secretary of state offices in Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, right? Because, like, okay, yeah, the House matters, the Senate matters. But if we didn't have pro-democracy, constitutional officers in those places, what you're talking about would be much worse, that they would just steal it.
Yeah.
Right. And so thank God that we have in Michigan, like a Gretchen Whitmer and a Jocelyn Benson, and that we have a Josh Shapiro in Michigan, and that we have a Tony Evers in Wisconsin, and that we have an Adrian Fontes as Secretary of State, and a Katie Hobbs as governor in Arizona. Right. Because we've seen, when we don't have that, look what's happening in Georgia now, right? Yeah. They have these election integrity boards or whatever they're calling them. And that's, to me, what that really is, Griff. And this is like how you have to think about this. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. This is like Brian Kemp's ability to say, okay, Trump's going to lose anyway, but I can say that, like, I'm just MAGA enough in a 2028 primary, right? Like, that's how cynical these people are.
Yeah. They don't want to piss off the base too much. They want to be able to say, well, I did my part.
Right.
But they know how this is going to come down.
Right.
And yeah, imagine Governor Kerry Lake in Arizona if that had happened. That's just.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how can people support you and the work you're doing going up to the election and beyond?
So first and foremost, please go to jointheunion.us. That's jointheunion.us. And, please, again, there's a sign-up form. There's a contribution form if that's something you're willing and able to do. I hope you'll also follow me on Substack. It's the Home Front. And, as we're recording this, I'm just about 24 hours away from my new podcast launching. It will also be called The Home Front.
Okay.
I hosted the Lincoln Project podcast for about 3.5 years. Love doing it. And now I'm, striking out on my own. So it'll be called The Home Front. You can find it wherever your favorite podcasts are found. And I hope everybody will take a listen.
Definitely.
And I just want to thank you for all you've done over the years, right? You guys have been, look, this stuff, as you know, Griff, the day in and day out is not glamorous.
No.
The nose to the grindstone stuff, it can wear on you. But I really do believe that, when we wake up on November 6th, that popular front, as you called it before we started recording, is going to be able to be proud and say, you know what, when the time came, we all locked arms together and we got it done, and we could take a breather, if only for a few hours, right? And get back to work.
Yeah. Go outside, grab a cup of coffee, come back in. It's time to go again.
Right.
Reed, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I really appreciate talking to you. You're doing great work over there. Please keep it up. We need you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.